This morning, I get to chat with a man that had not one, not two, but three different screenings at the Newport Beach Film Festival for his documentary, Fighting Spirit, A Combat Chaplain's Journey. Justin D. Roberts, how are you today?
Good, good. Glad to be here.
Listen, man, it is a pleasure to chat with you today. The documentary is absolutely fantastic. You yourself have become a focal point of the documentary because you yourself are a retired military chaplain.
I am. Yeah, and then this was kind of a wild journey with this film. It evolved, over time. At first, I was going to be just one of the people interviewed, then, then was brought on as a director and executive producer. So it's been interesting.
I will tell you this: you chaplains, all of you across every denomination that that is involved in the military, have got to be the toughest people in the military for the fact that not a single one of you carries a weapon. You are completely disarmed, running into battle.
Yeah, the not a lot of people know that much about military chaplains. It's a quiet profession. It's a profession of confessions. So chaplains typically are not going to be in media. You're not going to hear a lot of stories about chaplains. But interesting fact, in World War One, the number one MOS that had the highest rate of casualties was chaplains. In World War Two, that was the second highest rate, and in the Korean War, it was the third highest rate. And so, for as far as a job, I mean, it was throughout history, it was a dangerous job, and because you are going into harm's way, you are going to the front to provide care and support for these people in their last moments. And so I think that that's the beauty of this film is it's just starting to kind of get the story out there about what military chaplains do, but also trying to fight the stereotype of religious people. Period. There's some people who are just completely against people who are religious, and it's trying to introduce these human beings in the midst of this work. Beyond just the religion, who are they? Who are these people who are willing to risk their lives out of love to provide care for people in the worst of situations?
Yeah, the documentary not only focuses on you and the other chaplains, it also tells us that there are multiple denominations with this, whether various forms of Protestantism, Catholicism. There's a Muslim chaplain, there is a Buddhist chaplain, there's a Hindu chaplain. So all denominations and all religions are featured in this. Has
Yeah.
there ever been an issue where you, as a chaplain, have gone out and you were stationed, I believe, in Afghanistan and Iraq at one point, and the guy,
Yes.
and you're supposed to give spiritual counseling, and the guy goes, "Oh, you're not Catholic, I'm not going to talk to you. You're not Buddhist, you're Protestant, I don't want to deal with you." Like, has there ever been that level of rejection amongst people seeking spiritual counseling because you didn't belong to their denomination or faith?
No, that at least not my experience. You know, the way things happen in American culture is not the same that they happen in military culture. In American culture, people are divided by religion, they're divided by race, they're divided by politics. All these issues have become contentious, combative things in American society. But what I saw on the mountaintops of Afghanistan is people of all different kind of race, background, creed, religion were able to come together and be willing to even die for one another. That is the difference between civilian culture and military culture. I've said it before, like, I understood America so much more on the mountaintops of Afghanistan than I did coming back, to the States, because that is the thing that we should be. That is the ideal we should aspire to be, able to work together. And like the beauty of the Chaplain Corps is it's one of the most diverse organizations in the world with people who truly, truly believe in their faith, in their creed, but they're willing to work together with people of other faith groups, even risk their lives to support those individuals. And that is the beauty of the ideals of this country. That's what we're founded on. It's like, you might believe what you believe, but I'm willing to support you in it, even if I don't believe that, and defend your rights to do that, to practice your faith. And so that's what I experienced. And what I told, like, whenever I would get to a new unit and I would be in front of the formation, I would always tell them, like, look, y'all are a bunch of heathens, but you're my heathens, and I am your chaplain, and we're going to get through this together. And so, what chaplains do is we perform or we provide. So if you come to me and there's something particular, let's say that you're like on the Protestant side of the house, and then I can perform whatever religious service you need. But if I can't perform it, I'm going to provide for it. So if you're a Buddhist, if you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, if you're Wiccan, whatever your faith group, I'm going to try to get you connected so that way you can practice your faith. And but whenever life hits hard, whenever we're in the last moments, whatever it may be, I'm going to be there with you and I'm going to meet you where you're at. And so, if it's somebody who's dying on the battlefield, I'm going to be with them in the moment. I'm not pushing my faith on anybody, but I am going to meet them and love them and try to help them, through the hardest moments.
When were chaplains, or when did chaplains have their weapons taken away from them? Because it doesn't seem like this goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War or even the Civil War. This seems like more of a recent phenomena where they're like, oh, you're supposed to be a man of God or a man of faith. We're taking your guns away. The only thing you have is a knife just in case you need to cut a cord.
Yeah, no, I don't know the answer on that one. I wish I was a chaplain historian. I'm a D student. So uh, I know it's by order of the chief of chaplains, and this kind of gets into not just American warfare, but the rules of warfare with international community. So at first, medics were going to be recognized as non-combatants as well, so therefore should not carry weapons, and chaplains were put under that umbrella. But as we've seen, there's a lot of countries, they don't care if it's a medic or not, they're going to shoot at them, even if they see that red cross. And so medics are now carrying weapons, but the chaplains have still been kept as a non-combatant status and trying to, keep them in that lane. So, yeah.
So how do you decide to go into a military life and then on top of that decide to be a chaplain?
For me personally, my grandfather served in 3 wars, at the occupation of Japan in World War II, served in Korea in the beginning of Vietnam, and then his son died shortly after serving in Vietnam, in a training accident. And every generation we've had somebody in the military in our family. So I knew I was going to go into the military, but I felt called to ministry when I was 15. So I didn't know how to piece those two together at first, though. My short background, my father was a drug dealer. It was a rough upbringing. A church wound up getting me a Bible. And after my father attempted suicide, I was thinking about suicide myself. But I started going through this Bible, and then that's where I found my hope. That's where I found my faith and this relationship with God. And so that was when I was 13. And then when I was 15, I was like, I just feel called. I felt that leading in my life. And it's not like, I don't think of it as a profession. I didn't think of it in that context then, and I don't really now. It's just a relationship to people. My job is to love people. My job is to care, to provide support, and to actually love people, not to do it because it's a job, or even my theology. Like, this is the natural flow, my relationship to God, my relationship to people. And so I finally put those two things together. I found out about the chaplaincy, like there was a way that I could bridge these two things. And so that's how I became a chaplain.
We talked about this very briefly at the Newport Beach Film Festival. I belong to one of the high churches. I belong to the Orthodox Church. And similar to Catholicism, and we'll get into one of the Catholic chaplains in a moment, we have confession, and we have, moments where we go and speak with our priests or our bishops and our clergy, and we seek absolution. And since Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, the lower Protestant churches, whether, well, high church, high Protestant would be Presbyterian, but Presbyterian and going down into the Anabaptists and even
Yeah.
modern evangelical churches don't have a form of confession, don't have a form of that sacrament in being able to lay their burdens on their clergy. And you
Mhm.
being a clergyman yourself and of the Protestant faith, you didn't have that option. How do you seek spiritual counseling when that's not offered to you in your own denomination?
I think that's a big question. And so it's like each denomination has naturally evolved some systems of getting the burdens off the chest, and and also too, it's like their relationship to the priesthood, to ministers. That's been an evolving theology. So the need to do that confession, like with Martin Luther, and I don't know like how deep we want to go down this rabbit hole, but that was, everything came under question. Once the Protestant church broke away, there wasn't just a theological disagreement of here is the right way. It's a lot of it became, well, this was the Catholic way. What are we in relation to that? And so there's priests. We're not going to do priests. It's like they do it this way. They do confession. We're not going to do confession. Some of them would keep on some of those traditions, but so many of them broke away from that as a movement to get from that. But they threw the baby out with the bathwater in a lot of ways. So that now there's not that tradition, and you see a desire for some of those things, those spiritual elements, like with the Orthodox, the iconography, the worship through art and architecture. There was those things that created that spiritual experience that was lost, and there is that desire, I think, in a lot of the churches and in the Christian faith. So they're in this weird crossroads now of trying to figure out, like with the deconstruction movement, trying to figure out what is our next pathways, what is our next steps. And what's weird is at any point in time, we have this historical amnesia, that thinking that we have arrived at the perfect theology. This is the place where we're going to stand as Christians. We finally found the right solution, the right balance of all things. And then the judgment start of all the other denominations from that spiritual perspective, like looking down at this group, that group, and also everybody else in history. No, we finally arrived. But what's always happens is this is an evolving faith. The faith that we practice now is not what it looked like 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. So the question is, what is it going to look like going forward? And how much is it going to change? And right now it is at a major changing point. It is at a major pivoting point. Me, I'm not Protestant. I'm closer to being a Christian mystic, possibly a heretic. I don't define my theology out in public very often, but what I do know is that the core elements, like confession, naturally happens when you love people. They're going to come to you for confession. They're going to come to you for counsel. That is a natural thing. So there's so much that can be forced within the denomination, but whenever you are operating out of the heart of God, the Holy Spirit's moving in your life, and you are loving people, they are going to come to you to confess what's going on in their life and in their hearts. So I think that there is a structural thing that can happen out of our theology, but the truth is you can have that structural thing but not have the heart of God, and that thing is going to be dead. When you do have the heart of God, those things will be happening no matter what. And you don't need a structure to perform that, to tell you to do that, because it's going to naturally happen when you have a right relationship with God and a right relationship with people.
Now, with everything
that's a long answer.
But it's a good answer. That's what we want.
Yeah.
It's not just like, that's it. No, this is a good answer. Because with fighting spirit.
Well, it's like, it's like a couple that's really in love. Yeah. A couple that's really in love. And that sincere, selfless love, the two of them have a selfless love for one another. they're going to be hitting all the marks of what people would say you should do in your relationship. They're going to do it naturally. And a couple that's not in love, they could be hitting all of those marks, but the relationship's dead. So it has to be a natural relationship with God. It has to be real. It has to be genuine. Otherwise, what are you doing? Why even have a church? I mean, there's tons of churches out there. God's not present. They're not operating out of love. They don't love him. They're there for themselves. They're there, check off a box. They're flowing through the motions, but the heart of God isn't passionately moving there. Then
Sell
what are you
financial
doing?
books, disguised as
Yeah,
theology.
yeah. They don't want people thinking they're a bad Christian, so they just show up.
And that leads us back to fighting spirit and the fact that you went from part of the documentary to being the subject matter. Because in the documentary, you tell us about your own crises of faith and
Mhm.
this bit of survivor's guilt that so many people have. And yet now it leads us to Father Emil and how he served as a chaplain and, helped his units as POWs, prisoners of war.
Yeah.
And, Blessed Father, who might be canonized soon as a saint, or might soon be
Yeah.
canonized as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. How does that inspire you to either have a redress of grievances with your own traditions or bring you back to your traditions?
I the First is like, this was with Paulist, which amazing group of people. Mike, Rich, David, they shepherded this thing in a brilliant way. And Rich was just so instrumental as co-director and a producer in getting this, the whole full story put together. Because this film went through a lot of evolutions, a lot of different steps. It had different leaders at different points. So like you start off with one vision, and then another vision comes in, another vision comes in, and then they had to combine all that. Which Holly, our editor, she's brilliant. She's amazing. I hope everybody recognizes her art in the midst of all this, because she had a very difficult task. For me, on this, I've never had an issue with working with different faith groups, because of course I was an Army chaplain. That's like the bread and butter of it. Your ability to work together. As far as like me, my crisis of faith was never a crisis of faith. For me, my struggle in the midst of all the stuff that I went through, the unit that I was attached to was the most suicidal battalion in 2009. We had a suicide my second day on the job, another a week later, then another one, and a suicidal ideation every single week for the first 6 months. My counseling load was nonstop. And for me, the struggle in the midst of this was also, when my father attempted suicide, he permanently brain damaged himself. And then that's when I became suicidal and was really struggling. And then that's when I came across the Bible. But that suicide issue popped right back up again with my first unit. And it was non-stop counselings, a lot of 3 a.m. counselings, at least once a week. So I can't, I'm not using hyperbole. It was just a heavy workload. But it was also, the workload wasn't just like little issues, little things. Every single thing was a heavy and powerful and painful thing. And if you function from a place of empathy, then every single one of those things is going to rip your heart out. And this was all before we even deployed. And then we deployed and we had 200 Purple Hearts out of an 800-man unit and 18 killed in action. So I was burnt out. And then when I went to my next unit, there was a shortage of chaplains. We were needing chaplains. So I was over 3 different squadrons, 2,400 soldiers in Germany. There was never a point where I had the ability to heal and process. And so when I got out of the military, I just sank. But also too, it's like part of the reason why I spiraled was because I was removed from my support system. That is one of the amazing things about the military. Well, military, you're going through combat. It's horrible. It's awful. And if you're a chaplain, you're helping all these different people, and it can burn you out. But you're also with people who would die for you, who love you. They would give their life for you. So you have an amazing support system. You're in that pack, but whenever you step out of that pack, you lose that support system. So that's why you see a lot of veterans, like the service members are fine, they're fine, they're fine. They get out of the military, boom. That's where all those problems start. In part is because you pulled them away from the pack, the thing that was keeping them going, keeping them surviving. And that for me, it wasn't a crisis. I never questioned God. And I'm not saying that from like, I'm so great. It's just that for me and my relationship to my theology, my relationship to God, is that I know him. I know him. I mean, like, I might not always be happy about what's going on in my life. I might not always be happy about my relationship to him, but I know him. I can't deny it. It's just something that I know just as much as I know anything else in my life. It's an experiential knowledge. So I would have to, it'd be like saying I don't know my mother, like I just know God. And so it was never a crisis of faith in that. What it was the amount of despair and hurt and pain that I saw and experienced. I never had time to process and grieve. I never had time to mourn because I was always working and doing it. And so when I finally got out, it all just hit, and it hit hard, and it took me a while to process, to kind of come back into it. And it's like, what I hate is the Christian jargon of, well, you just need to pray, or you just need to X, Y, and Z, and just, the Holy Spirit is just going to take it off your chest. Like, you moron, you haven't read the Bible. You haven't actually read Psalms and listened to David, who experienced all of the same stuff. Like, they give you these little platitudes and throw it at you from like thinking that they're at a higher spiritual level than you, and they just know better. And then they throw you short bits of advice, and it's all horrible advice. If you actually read Psalms, then you see the suffering. Like, you hear David, who was a warrior. He lost so many friends. He was in the middle of combat where he's sticking a knife or a sword into people's chests. He saw the bloodshed and the suffering and the wailing, and he saw that happening to his friends. And there is a heart in the book of Psalms of a soldier who's grieving and broken and crying out to God. And so you see that PTSD, you see that depression and despair, and this heart crying out, help me, help me. And so that's the human experience in warfare. And if we have a little bit of humility, if we have a little bit of honesty, then there are no short, quick answers on this. There's nobody who's doing it perfectly. Nobody in the scriptures did it perfectly. We are all in anguish. We're all desperate. And if we have the capacity to be honest, that's where the solutions start to come out. Whenever you see that nobody else around you is really doing it perfectly, we're all struggling, then we have the ability to then be honest and say, hey, I'm not doing so good. I'm trying, but I'm not making it right now. Then you can get help. Then we lower the suicide rate. But we cannot lower the suicide rate with our current culture. It will not work. Doesn't matter how many programs we do, how much money we throw at it. Until we change our culture and the ability to talk about our issues, we will not lower the suicide rate, which is still roughly at 22 per day. We've been at this for 20 years. And like, what's that definition of insanity? Doing the same thing, but expecting different results. We have to not look at it as an individual medical issue. We have to look at this as a cultural issue. And I know it's not just either. This is across society, American society. Until we have a better culture and our ability to discuss these things, the problem will not be fixed. But so this film, in some ways, is an attempt to do that, to start this conversation. And we can't do that unless we ourselves are vulnerable.
One thing I want to ask you before we get back to the documentary, and we're going to get into the four chaplains and
Yeah.
Father Emil as well.
You have to like steer me because I will go.
No, this is beautiful because we got to weave it all in together. Because the next question I want to ask is a military question. It's this, and it's a historical one because your grandfather was a survivor of 3 different wars.
Yeah.
So we have an 8 to 12 week boot camp, depending which branch of the military you're in.
Yeah.
So the military builds you, breaks you down and builds you up into the ideal soldier. In your grandfather's generation after World War II, we'll go back to World War I and into World War II, the flights back were very, very sparse. You had to take that month-and-a-half journey across the Atlantic or the Pacific to get back to the United States. And you had that time they weren't called support groups then, but to commiserate with your brothers in arms and to work through it during that time. Vietnam rolls around and you're in the jungle for X amount of years, and then they put you on a 16-hour plane ride home, and they're like, good luck, go back to civilian life.
Yeah.
In modern times now, 50 years removed from Vietnam, and we've seen the suicide rate, and there hasn't been much help for these veterans. Would it be wise for the military to create a boot camp to return soldiers to civilian life? Because we don't have that month-and-a-half on the boat in the ocean to work out these things, now we need those 12 weeks back to reacclimate to civilian life.
I think that's part of the solution. I think and I've heard talk of a reverse boot camp. I think that's absolutely, but we also have to keep in mind, like, the cultures that we had back then were very different. We used to have a front porch society where people actually had front porches that they would sit on and talk with their neighbors. And they did life together so much more intimately than we do now. It was much more of a village mindset with many more connections. So if you look at, how they did life back then compared to just how the civilian population does life now, because that veteran's just being put into the civilian population, you only process trauma with other people and with those human connections. So even if you do take them through a reverse boot camp, you're still throwing them into an isolated society. So they're still going to be jacked up. I mean, you can't solve those problems, all that trauma that they've been through in 8 weeks. And a counselor is only part of the solution. But if you take a counselor and then you still have a person who has no friends, no close relationships with their family, they're, isolated in society, that counselor can't fix that. That program can't fix that. What we have to have is a better developed system of creating those connections with the veteran nonprofits that has to be much more intentional, much more integrated in creating tribes. So that way they will process their trauma then, but you process more of your trauma is processed with friends and conversations while doing life together. And, like World War I population, mass amount of people served. So massive amount of the civilian society was veterans. Same thing again with World War II. So many were veterans. So when they came home to that community that was playing baseball and, doing front porch, backyard barbecues, things like that, those dudes were veterans. So it was easy to find that veteran community. Now only 1% serve. So it's a smaller portion of the population that, understands the trauma you've been through and is patient and gracious with it. But 2, there's just not as many natural connections within society. So it's a complex issue. The best shot we have is, the veteran organizations that are out there, those becoming much more social, a lot more rock climbing, paintball, social activities that allow you to have those human connections. So that way those friendships are born, and through those friendships, you process your trauma.
Makes a lot of sense. And, unfortunately, someone who didn't get a chance to process his trauma, but helped enough men do so, is Father Emil Kapaun. Am I pronouncing his last name correctly?
Yeah, Emil Kapaun. Yeah.
Kapaun,
well, it's
Capon
for the Wichita, Kansas folks.
Okay.
So they just have that little accent on it, but yeah.
All right,
Everywhere
because
else is
we
like
want
a
to do
bomb.
him justice because we want to pronounce it the way his family
I
wants it
know.
pronounced.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and that was we went through so many discussions on that, like how to do it, how to pronounce it, and they were like, "Come on, it'll be fine."
all right. So Father Emil was a military chaplain
Hmm.
that was also, lived up to the motto of be wise as a serpent, but as gentle as a dove.
Yeah.
Even in a POW camp, he was able to get tobacco and supplies and sneak out undetected and come back and serve his captured brethren
Yeah.
in these military bases. Can you tell us a bit more about Father Emil and how his story touched you and helped you reevaluate your ideals in life?
Yeah. Like this was just just small miracles because like we were already done filming when we found out that his remains were coming home. And so it was Chaplain Brandon Moore. It was like, you guys have to incorporate his homecoming into the story. It's critical. It's critical. And so he kept fighting for that. And it's like, it did become it. So this was a real partnership with the Army Chaplain Corps. Yeah, they had a major influence in how the story was told. This was part of that. So, his remains were lost he died in the Korean War. And then his remains were lost for 70 years. And then 2 years ago, they were found, and he was flown back home in Wichita, Kansas, for what became an international pilgrimage. Wichita, stopped, created a big parade for his homecoming, and they filled up an entire stadium for his funeral. And so it was a major historical event for what might become an American saint, you know. So I think with his life though, that is something worth examining. It's like he was overtaken and captured because he would not flee and leave the wounded when the enemy was, doing a counterattack and pushing over their position. So he wouldn't abandon the wounded. And then there was one soldier who was going to be killed because he couldn't walk. So he pushed a guard out of the way who was about to shoot him and then covered over him. And it's a miracle that guard didn't shoot him for that. But then he carried that guy 70 miles to get back to the prison camp. And that guy lived, I think, into his 90s. But that was the type of guy that he was. The heart of what a chaplain should be is that kind of love, that kind of courage, that willingness to go, as one of the chaplains told me, like, be where it sucks the most, wherever it's the worst, wherever it's the most horrible, be there in the presence and to deliver the love of God. And that's what Emil was doing. It's like he is the perfect example of that. The kind of person, he will give his life for you. That expresses God's love in the most beautiful way. And I think that so much of our conflicts are between selfishness and selflessness. There are people who are truly selfish, narcissistic, straight up evil, and they view everything through this paradigm of, what can I get out of you? What can I get out of this? Can I get fame? Can I get my name out there more? Can I get more money out of this? What is it in for me? And they see this reality as the world through that lens, and they also project it onto you, thinking that you think that way too. But then you have people like Emil Kapaun, who's, I'm going to die for you. I'm going to give for you. I'm going to do whatever it takes to support you. I suspect that if he was sneaking out of that prison to go steal, food and medicine for the guys, you could have just left. Or even before, like whenever the enemy was coming and they knew it, he could have just left the wounded. And so many people would think that from that other perspective on life, that is insane. Only a crazy person would do that. And so they don't, it seems like foolishness to them. scriptures, like, that all of this seems like foolishness to some people, but to the people who truly love God, this is the only way. Like, this is God's love. This is how God's love operates. And whenever, for Emil Kapaun, and I've known guys who are like that. I mean, we had guys, so many of our guys that I lost in my first unit, almost every single one of them, it was, out of this selfless love that they're putting themselves in harm's way. So when we were looking at these chaplains, it's the same thing. And it's, of course, when you truly love other people, you're going to give your life for them. And but it wasn't just a one-time moment for him. He just kept doing it and kept doing it with every action, which shows, like, the true heart that he was operating out of. So, yeah, I mean, like, this is, I think this film is a memorial to him and some of these other chaplains, a digital memorial. And I think the beautiful thing is like, he lived this life, but somebody's going to see this film and say, and it's going to strike their heart that that's the kind of life that they want to live too, something that's greater than themselves, to live a life out of pure love. And they'll become inspired by him, and then they will go and then do the same thing. And I think that's the beauty of all this. If we just tell their stories and honor those people who do these kind of works, then it inspires that next generation to do the same thing. And we need more of that in this world.
And the documentary also touches upon, going back to the Civil War, Chaplain Garland.
Yes.
Who was an escaped slave that ran to Canada, gets word that President Lincoln is not going to prosecute and return escaped slaves, joins the Union Army as a chaplain.
Yeah.
We have Chaplain Garland's writings. We have all his documentations. Why do I know this is, a thankless job where no one wants to be recognized for it. But why has society 160 years later not recognized Chaplain Garland for this?
I think that's one of the big struggles. Like, America was a promise delayed. Like, it's like we had this grand ideal of freedom for all and a place where everyone would be free. And then it took us a civil war to finally begin working on that promise to deliver it. And there was so many amazing people who stepped up to deliver on that promise and make it happen. Like, Chaplain Garland, White, I think we're just now coming out of, like, finding the remnants of these things, these moments in history. And my hope is that these become individual stories, like scripted features, or books that pull people in. Like, that's my hope, that these lessons can begin learned and just examined more closely. But that's the struggle with a project like this, is like, there are so many amazing stories, like, and there was a few that we had to kind of like leave on the cutting room floor because we couldn't fit them all into a documentary. So I think now that it'll be viewed, I do think that some people's must spark on like these stories as a larger format. Yeah.
It also makes me wonder if we had gone with Thomas Jefferson's original Declaration of Independence in outlawing the Atlantic slave trade and banning slavery by a certain year once the Union was officially a country, and not having to rewrite the Declaration and not rewriting this notion of 3/5 of a person, what the country would have looked like sooner.
Oh gosh, I mean, I think that's the great struggle. It's like having an ideal, a noble ideal, and then feeling like, oh, it's not practical though, or I have all these selfish interests for not living up to that ideal. And Yeah, we could have been a completely different country if we just held to that, and that might have saved us a civil war. But you know, that'll always be our country's sin. But hopefully, like, we learn from these lessons. But I also think too, there's always like a Machiavellian type of perspective on how to do government and how business should be done. And you often hear, if you bring up, you know, um, a moral principle, the response usually isn't like, I want to do this evil thing. They don't come out and say that. Like, in every instance, whenever you bring up a moral principle that's an issue within business or within the government or something like that, it's always, well, that's just not how business is done, or no, that's just not the smart way of doing it. And you look back through human history, that's always the issue. So even with our founding fathers, they were just like, well, it's just bad for business. We need this money coming in. They had all these selfish reasons, and greed, that led them to commit horrific acts of evil. And it took a civil war and all of those lives being lost to finally start to live up to our promise. And I think we're still fighting for that.
Yeah. Well, your documentary does all these men and women justice. And let's go into real quick the chapel of what is it? The chapel of the four chaplains. I'm sorry, I'm butchering the name, but
Yeah.
two Protestant ministers, a rabbi, and a Catholic priest.
It sounds like a barge
went
doesn't it?
down with the ship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That again, it's like, you see the golden thread through almost all these stories is, these chaplains that are willing to give their life out of love for others. That's the golden thread. I mean, like, they have so little in common outside of that. But what they do have in common is a sincere love of God, a sincere belief in God, and a sincere love for, the soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen. They truly do care. And that's their job. It's the greatest job in the world. It's like, your job is just to care about people. But yeah.
Yeah. The fact that one by one gave up their life preservers.
Yeah.
We're directing people. We're getting to higher ground as the ship began to sink. And I believe it was the rabbi that had two small children.
Mm-hmm.
Or was it one of the ministers?
I think it was a rabbi.
Had two small children and knew this was the end. And it was the sacrifice for literally God and country, and knew that his children were going to be without a father, but were not going to be without an example, is an absolute selfless act.
Yeah. Yeah, like, that is that's where the harder decisions come in, because this is not just something that you are doing individually, but it's your family that's making the sacrifice as well. We often think of just the service members, but in truth, every single one of the service members has a mom, has a dad, many have a wife, many have kids. And that sacrifice, the burden, is made by that service member, but carried on by those families, for decades to come. And, it's a heavy, heavy burden to bear that our gold stars, the people who've lost their loved ones, they're the ones who bear it going on. But it is that kind of example, though, that those chaplains gave of how we should love people, how we should care, and be willing to make these sacrifices on behalf of others.
Speaking of which, you're a married man with a few children, and your wife knew you before you went in and knew you as a different man coming out.
Yeah.
Your marriage has taken 3 different stages of Justin pre-military, Justin returning from service. Well, 4, with Justin being in the service, Justin returning from service, and then Justin rediscovering himself.
Yeah.
How does this affect your marriage and your relationship, not only with your wife, but your children, that see this evolution of Justin Roberts go from civilian to military man to near broken chaplain on his return to redemption?
I I think it's always evolving. Like anybody who's in a profession of trauma goes through this. Like human beings, if you're empathetic, if you're a sociopath, it's not that hard. It's like they're fine, you know, they don't care if you don't have empathy. But if you do have empathy, then going through trauma, a profession of trauma, is going to be a heavy, heavy burden. And the individual is not the only one who bears it. When you're struggling with depression, everybody who loves you is struggling with depression too. They're not, might be not their depression, but they're struggling with your depression. And so that's how you process these things. You have to be intentional about it. It has to be open communication. It has to be leaning in and working on it. And there was somebody, I heard this the other day, that somebody was like, you know, how beautiful is it that, you know, if you're with a group of people who have seen, you know, 10 different versions of you and they love every single one of them. The people that I'm connected to have cared for me through every version of me. And I know that they're going on, they'll continue caring for me, because like I still have combat in front of me. I still have more trauma in front of me. And, you know, going back to Ukraine, and this is a different kind of trauma. And we have a lot of future conflicts in front of us. You know, the fight for democracy is not just in America. And, you know, that all of it is horrible. You know, all of it is painful. So it's a lot to, you know, continue processing. Yeah.
You know, Paulus Productions is the one that is distributing your documentary, and I think the last time I talked to them was for the story about Father Bud. And through them, your documentary of Fighting Spirit was shown at the Vatican, and it got the blessing of Pope Francis. What's the reaction like, not only from your fellow chaplains, but then when you get it all the way to the Pope in Vatican City, and have the reaction of the Roman Catholic Church, especially when talking about Father Emil?
It's been beautiful. I think the chaplain corps is a quiet profession, and they don't like the spotlight, you know, and it's not out of like false humility. It really is the disposition of the chaplain corps is, we are here to love others, to care for others, and to focus on others. And it feels somewhat wrong. Even I struggle with that. Like, don't put me next to, you know, Father Kapaun or any of these other amazing chaplains. I'm not in the same tier, you know? It feels wrong, you know, on that level, if there's ever that kind of comparison. You know, these are guys who fought and died. I mean, like, you know, provided care and even died while doing their job. I didn't. And so, you know, the levels that they went to were just truly miraculous. So it's like, it feels, you know, odd to be in that story element, like, you know, even one of those that was interviewed. But I like the place as the storyteller, though, you know, to point that spotlight in that direction. And I think the chaplain corps is the same way. They're like, let's talk about how great these guys are. They want to move the conversation that way. Like, yes, they deserve to be heard about. And they get nervous when the camera starts moving towards them. They're like, oh, no, it's over there, over there. And which is a beautiful culture, honestly, because like how many cultures are like, no, me, you know, and it's that kind of selfie culture where they want the spotlight on the self. And the chaplain corps is very different about that, but they've been very grateful that these stories are documented and honored. You know, for some people, this is a movie. For other people, this is a memorial, you know, to honor these chaplains that made this sacrifice. So that way it's not forgotten.
And what was the chaplains corps reaction in seeing this when you presented to the higher ups over there?
Oh, they've been super supportive. I mean, that same kind of feeling of, you know, just that these chaplains were honored and memorialized, so that way the stories aren't lost in time. And a
Is it,
lot of these stories were forgotten about. A lot of these stories were maybe remembered by chaplains, but not many more people beyond that, right? Like, not a lot of people can tell you what a chaplain does. Not, not a lot of Americans even know that we have chaplains. So we have to change that, but the only way we change that is by telling a story, so that way people can find out about these amazing individuals.
is this going to become part of the training for the chaplain corps and, being presented the documentary and go, look, you guys are going to go out there, this is part of the
Yep.
job that you have to acknowledge as a possibility?
I hope so. I mean, it's like, I don't want to make any presumptions. I know the chaplain corps is figuring out how this can best be used as a tool to do their mission, and I do hope that it becomes a part of that legacy and inspires that next generation. Like, I mean, for me, the primary event in all this and working on this film, and I think for a lot of people working on this film, is the hope that it leads to future chaplains, that it helps recruit that next generation of chaplains, and not just people who want the job, but people who want the ministry, really do want to serve these soldiers and these other service members. Like, the idea that you were a part of inspiring that person who goes on and does an incredible job of giving hope to people, who helping them in the worst moments of their life, that you had some small part in helping that person get to that person who's in need, that is everything, right? Like, what else? Like, for me, that's what brings joy in my life. I mean, that inspires me, that motivates me to do work, knowing that we can be a part of helping that person who's hurting, because, like, then you can die happy. Yeah.
So, how would one go about becoming a military chaplain? Is there a special ordination through the military? Is it through your denomination and then you got to go through boot camp? Is there an age limit? Is there
Oh,
also something where civilians that have a ministry background can help on the return of military veterans when they get stateside? Like, how do we take those steps if we want to become either chaplains or affiliated with the chaplain corps on the civilian side?
it's a little bit of yes to all that. It's a process. So you have to have training within the military, within your denomination, grad school. It's a certain number of hours, and you have to have that degree. You can do the candidate program while you're starting that. So, like, after college, you get into your seminary or graduate school process. You can then start the candidate program, where you start chaplain officer basic corps, and so it's a corps just for chaplains. Because it is a unique culture within the military, and so they give you the basics of military training. They get you up and running, but also you're getting established into the chaplain culture, which is a part of the education process too. We are approaching the military in a very different way. We have all the officer elements. We have to operate as a military officer, but you need to be a chaplain, and you need to understand how to approach that in the right way. And so they give you that full education. It's actually really phenomenal. They do prepare you for the military experience and also for combat, because you do have to be ready for that when that hits. And if you join the military, it's probably going to hit. We have future conflicts coming up, and so we do need those future chaplains. But you do have to have some ministry experience, and you do have to be ordained within your denomination and endorsed by your denomination. So it can't be just a random person who comes off the street and is like, I want to be a chaplain. No, it's like, you need to be a part of a collective tradition that is going to say, yes, you are not a nut job and not just some random crazy person. You do have to have a belief tradition, because then they also need to know, well, the other religious people out there who are in the military, like, where to place you. How are you going to be meeting those people's needs? Because it's not about you. Like, I want to be a chaplain and then you become a chaplain. No, you're there to do a job and service other people, help other people. So they need to help steer you in that direction till you can help those people.
And is there like when you go to the enlistment office, for example, Do you say, you know, here's my background. I have a master's degree in XYZ theological studies. You know, I've been a minister of this faith for 3 years, for example. I would like to join the
Yeah,
military, but in the chaplain corps. Can you make that specific request ahead of time? Or they're
yeah.
like, yeah, 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 and then they make you a mechanic.
No, no. It's like they're fighting to get chaplains, and so the chaplain corps has its own recruiters, and so you would connect with a chaplain recruiter, and then they would walk you through the process. And if you already have your seminary degree or graduate degree, and you meet those requirements, and they can get you through the process at a decent speed, and then get you into basic training. And so um, they prepare you well. Like we're good at that in the military.
Fantastic. And is there a charity that you guys are working with and a veteran outreach if people want to contribute from the civilian side?
Um, at this time, it doesn't have a designated charity. It's still, going through the distribution process, getting that stuff set up. Paulist is a production company, but they're going to be still, working through the distribution steps. And, it'll be a little bit of time before it's out for the general public. But it is, uh, you know, it'll start hitting those marks as far as like not just making an impact as a movie, but making an impact, helping people process what they've been through, understand more about the chaplain corps, all those other things. It those things will begin to line up because usually the nonprofits, the ones that would really connect with this, those conversations will start too, and then seeing how this can be utilized, to support the overall mission, helping people.
Well, the official website is fightingspiritfilm.com. It's associated with polistproductions.org. A fantastic documentary when it comes to fighting spirit. Where can we find you on social media, and where can we find the film if we want to connect with you and set up a special screening for Fighting Spirit, a combat chaplain's journey?
At this stage, it would be through Paulist Productions. It's I got to be a director on it, an executive producer, but they're the ones who are shepherding the film and the next stages it goes to. And I'm going back to Ukraine, so I won't be doing a lot of stuff for a while. I'm back in production mode, and so back to the front and telling the next story. But Polished Productions is going to be that primary point of contact on this film, and then finding me on TikTok, it's at Do Good Army, and on other social media, Instagram is Justin D Roberts, and Echo Bravo Productions is my company. And so, for as a point of contact, but I'm usually just working on the films, kind of like leaning forward.
Well,
So,
Ukraine is just going to get even harder since they just shut down the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical one, and that's
yes,
85% of all Christianity in Ukraine. So we'll see how that goes.
yes. That is like that when it comes to like that has been such a big conversation over like where Russia's influence on the church, on the religion. You start getting into those individual conversations with the Ukrainians, like that is a big subject and they're wrestling with it of, how are they going to proceed? And then some are just straight up leaving the church. So where is the faith element in the midst of servicing in that? I do know some of have contacts with the Ukrainian chaplains, but most of my stuff has been like kind of, forward position at the front, like Donbass, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, covering the combat stuff. But I have met with the rabbi, have met with a few of the chaplains, and they're engaging on that conversation too. But when you have politics and religion mixed, and it's messy, so it's going to be interesting to see how it gets resolved. And I know that Ukraine is going to be leaning forward to figure that out. And it's probably going to be an Orthodox answer, is my suspicion. But yeah.
Well, like I said when we first met, get yourself an icon of Saint Justin the Martyr, so so you can be safe
Yes.
while you're out there.
Yeah, I need to.
Yeah.
I'm going to hunt one down.
Justin D. Roberts, it has been a great pleasure chatting with you about Fighting Spirit, a combat chaplain's journey. Thank you so much for your time today. Please keep in touch. Please stay safe. And you are definitely doing the work of God, going out there and now being a documentarian and not just a military chaplain.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you.